Hello, I'm Karen Capenteris, Associate State Director for AARP Michigan, and I want to welcome you to today's presentation on fall gardening. Our presenter today, Isabel Brandstrom, will not only share with you great information on fall planting, but also on resources that include websites and phone numbers that you can use to get all of your gardening questions answered. For those of you who are interested in what other wonderful virtual events we have coming up, please go to the AARP Michigan virtual events page, and you can find all the great things that we have planned. You can see at the bottom of your screen, I think, you can go to aarp.org/mi and then click on AARP Michigan virtual events. Today we'll be answering the questions that you have at the end of the presentation. So to submit a question, please post it in the comments section, and you can do this at any time during today's presentation. It's my privilege now to introduce you to two people involved in today's presentation. Isabel Brandstrom is the MSU Extension Consumer Horticulture Educator based in Ingham County. Isabel educates gardeners about plants and the environment. She was born in South Florida and received her undergraduate degree in horticultural sciences from the University of Florida in Gainesville. She then ventured north to study horticulture and received her master's degree from Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. When Isabel isn't thinking, reading, or speaking about plants, she's probably sewing. Teresa Cooper is an advanced master gardener and received her certification from MSU Extension in 2014. Gardening is a passion of Teresa's, and she loves learning from other gardeners and sharing what she knows. She often says, gardening is a lifelong adventure. Teresa is a volunteer with AARP Michigan, and she also volunteers at local public gardens such as Parkwood Y in Hazlet and the Resource Center for the Greater Lansing Food Bank. Welcome to both of you. I know you're both on mute there.
Yeah, thank you, Karen.
You're welcome. So in the essence of time, Teresa and I are now going to leave the screen and let Isabel get into the substance of today's presentation.
Perfect. Yeah. So yeah, like Karen said, we are going to be talking about fall vegetable gardens today. And I realized the date on that title slide is wrong. We are doing this a little bit earlier than what we did last year because I wanted to incorporate some information about planting like brassica crops, so things like broccoli and cauliflower, which if you want to plant those in your garden and sort of start them indoors, now is really the time to start doing that. And we'll cover it later in the presentation. So like Karen said, my name is Isabel. I am a consumer horticulture educator with MSU Extension. I'm based out of Ingham County in Mason, Michigan, and I'm happy to be here talking about fall vegetables. Like it said in the sort of description of this event, I think fall vegetables are, gardening is not only for the spring and the summer. We can start thinking about planting vegetables in the fall so we can extend, our harvest from our garden. So let's get into it. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go through and sort of talk about what to plant and when to plant. And so what to plant we can think about, as we're moving into the fall, things are going to start getting cooler. So we're going to want to plant more of those cool season crops. And there's a list of them up there, things like broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, cauliflower, all of that good stuff, versus things like tomatoes and peppers, squash. Those are all more warm season crops. So we're going to focus in on what we call sort of these cool season crops. And there's a few options to get them started so you can transplant them out into the garden. It kind of just depends on, how invested you want to be, I guess. So, you can start your seeds indoors and then transplant them out. You can direct seed outdoors, or you can buy transplants from your local garden center. So we'll get into, talking about a few different plants and fall vegetables that you can incorporate into the garden. And now is the time, too, to start just planning, thinking about the space you're going to be working with, how much space you have to work with, and thinking about where you're located in the state when also trying to decide when to plant. So not only what to plant, but when to plant. So next slide. So I'm going to get into some of those things I mentioned. So deciding, what to plant, so what plants, and then also direct seeding or transplanting. So as far as transplanting versus direct seeding, pros to transplanting, you can start them indoors. They're not taking up space in the garden. You can keep those summer vegetables in, so things like tomatoes, peppers, until it's really time to start getting those fall crops out there when things are starting to get a little bit cooler and those warm season crops are kind of at the end, of their life, and you have your harvest from them. So they're taking up space indoors, but not outdoors in your garden. Transplanting is also a great way to kind of think about spacing of your crops. So you can really mindfully kind of space out your crops with these transplants. Spacing is really important as far as preventing disease, because when we think about, the garden and vegetables, we want a lot of airflow to kind of prevent any of those fungal diseases. So making sure you are following spacing recommendations, you can see them on the back of the seed packets. Sometimes there's notes in like the transplants that you'll buy, just being mindful of spacing of those plants. And then also another pro to transplanting, so kind of getting those larger seedlings out. I realize I didn't define what a transplant is, but it's kind of those smaller seedlings. So you can also get a jump start on the weeds versus direct seeding. You're putting some seeds in the ground. They're going to have to compete with weeds that are already there. So with those transplants, they're a little bit taller, they're a little bit bigger. They might be a little bit tougher to kind of compete with those weeds. Cons, if you are starting indoors, you're going to need that space indoors. You also need those materials. So things like, a grow light, trays, and sometimes a heat mat. So, there's cost to all of those materials that you might need versus just buying transplants from the garden center. Again, it's totally up to how much time and money you want to invest in your plants. But there's options out there for, whatever your preference of investment is. So next slide. So when to plant. It's really going to depend on your first frost date. So like I said, with our fall crops, things are kind of starting to get cooler. They sort of have this short window where they're going to grow and when we're going to be able to harvest them and when things are going to start getting a little too cold for them, right? So when you're going to plant is going to depend on when your first frost date is. So in this map I have up on the screen, it's a little hard to see Michigan. But you can see the first frost date, even in Michigan, will range depending on where you are. And another thing that is going to influence when you plant is not only, when that first frost is going to come, but also what tools you have for season extension. We're going to get into that a bit more, but these include things like row cover. Those are just season extension tools that are going to kind of keep that space a little bit warmer and allow you to kind of have a little bit longer with those crops outdoors before things get really, really cold, and they kind of just stop growing and producing. Another thing that's going to influence when you plant is the days to harvest for whatever plant you're planting. This can range from a month to 3 months. So really kind of backtracking from when that harvest date is, backtracking to figure out when you want to get it in the ground so you can have a harvest before that first frost date. Those are all going to influence when you are going to plant. So it takes a little bit of research to really understand, your first frost date, the days to harvest of the plants. And often, you can find information about your first frost date online. And the days to harvest, usually if you're starting from seed, you can see it on the back of the seed packet. And you can kind of just look up information. I know we have a publication on fall crops that give you a general days to harvest timeline for most of our common fall crops. So next slide. And now we're actually going to get into a few of those more common fall crops. So what to plant, these are options, to start indoors, start as transplants, often because they take a little bit more time. So you kind of want to give them a leg up by starting them indoors and letting them sort of get to that transplant stage before you get them outdoors. So first we're going to start with our brassica crops. So some of those leafy greens in this category are things like kale, collards, kohlrabi. So These can be great options for containers as well. I think especially kale does well in containers. Again, what to plant is going to depend on what sort of space you're working with. If you are working with, a garden in the ground versus container gardens versus raised beds, there's a lot to consider. And these brassica crops and things like kale do well in most of those spaces. So for a lot of these kind of leafy brassica greens, I think it's usually about 30 days to get them to that transplant stage. So that's why it's really helpful to kind of start them indoors beforehand and kind of plant them in the ground in September. Usually it's about 50 to 60 days to harvest. So if you plant in September, you'll probably be harvesting around October. So next slide. We'll get into some of the other brassicas. These ones I think are a little more challenging, and even sort of those earlier brassica leafy greens, just because they need more time. So if this is your first time planting a fall garden, I'll get to some of maybe the easier crops that you can try out first versus these more challenging ones that take a lot more or take significantly more time. You usually have to start them indoors. They're just a little more tricky, I guess I would say. But some of these other brassicas to start indoors include things like broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage. These ones, again, are usually about 30 days to get to that transplant state, so that, seedling that you can put outside. And then usually it's about, I think, 60 to 80 days to harvest. So if you are, starting these indoors, you'll want to get them to that transplant stage, usually in about August, and then get them in the ground, and you can be harvesting, often in October to November. This is also a great one, if you just want to buy your transplants. Broccoli, cauliflower, and cabbage transplants, just buying them at the garden center is also a great option. Again, just depends on how much time you want to invest in sort of getting these transplants started indoors. And if we can go back really fast, I just have one little blip. Again, if you're kind of getting more advanced and you really want to try these kind of more challenging brassica crops, I believe there's different sort of varieties out there that are bred for different times in the season. So I think especially for broccoli, there's sort of those spring varieties and then fall varieties. They're just kind of more adapted to those different parts in the season. I can't think of any, variety names off the top of my head, but a great place to look are those seed catalogs online. There's a lot of options. And just another thing I want to throw out there is that, we can find these varieties that are bred specifically for different times in the season. So spring versus fall. Next slide. Yeah, thank you. So these are the ones that I think are great for first time, fall gardeners. These green plants that you can start indoors and get them to that transplant state. So things like lettuce and spinach. Spinach really likes cooler temperatures to germinate. That's why I have that little asterisk next to it. I think it's usually, they just like cooler temperatures to germinate. I can't remember the temperature off the top of my head. But that is one that's kind of helpful to start indoors, just because, if we're direct seeding them, this month or next month, the soil might be a little bit warmer. So that's why starting them indoors and having more control over the soil temperature can be helpful. But you can certainly still direct seed spinach and lettuce outdoors as well. And these ones, I believe, are about 30 days to get to the transplant state that you can put outside, and then about 30 days to harvest. So these are sort of those shorter days to harvest as well. So good options for some of our first-time fall gardeners. Just try some lettuce and some spinach, and you'll be eating healthy too. So next slide. And another great option for first-time fall gardeners and, experienced fall gardeners as well, are different types of herbs. So one of the types that is helpful to start indoors and then put out as a transplant is fennel. Again, usually just because the growth period you need to get to that transplant stage is a little bit longer. I think it's about 35 days to get to that transplant point. And then once you get it out, it's about 60 days to harvest. So really, Deciding what you're going to start indoors and then plan out as transplants depends on how long it takes to get to that transplant stage and those days to harvest. So the ones that, need a little bit more time, so, more than 60 days, I would say, are generally the ones that we want to start indoors to make sure we kind of give them, that head start and then transplant them outside. So like I said, fennel is a great option to start indoors or plant out as a transplant. You can also, if you're not trying to harvest those seeds, it's a great one because you can just harvest the leaf fennel and sort of use that as like your flavoring and your herb portion. So another great option and a good option for those first-time fall gardeners because we're really just depending on the plant producing, those leafy parts versus like some type of fruit, thinking like a tomato or a pepper. We really just want to get it to the point where we can harvest some of those leaves. Next slide. So I'm going to briefly cover some of the tools that you'll need to start indoors. I'm not going to get too into the weeds as far as seed starting and things like that. There's a lot of great resources out there through MSU Extension, and I would, refer you to those resources. But as far as seed starting indoors goes, you usually need a grow light. As far as LED versus the other types, I think it's just going to depend on how much you want to invest in it. Some people have different preferences. It's really, I've learned kind of just experimentation and buying what's kind of in your budget and making it work. You'll need potting media and trays as well. I didn't list that one, but trays to start your seeds in, and then also being mindful of watering. So what I actually like to do when I'm watering my the seeds I'm starting indoors is I do a bottom water. So I have, a tray on top that has holes in it and like the little wells, and I'll put it into a tray that doesn't have any holes in it. So it's just like a solid tray. And then I just stick it in there. I let it sit for maybe about 3 minutes, and the soil is going to wick up that moisture. And that's the way I like to water, because if you top water, sometimes you get soil going everywhere. Sometimes it's a little challenging. But again, I think, learning these things and figuring out what works for you just comes with experience and trying new things. But I am a fan of bottom watering and letting that soil kind of wick up that moisture. And it helps me not overwater, which is a big thing too. Next slide. So these are crops and fall crops that you can direct seed outdoors. Honestly, some of my favorites are the root crops. So things like radish, turnip, beet, carrot, and rutabaga. These are great options to direct seed outdoors because they are root crops. Those hefty roots kind of take up space and can be kind of challenging to start indoors. So really just letting them get to full size in the ground is one of the easiest options. The ones I put little asterisks next to up there, so things like beets, carrots, and rutabagas, they might not get to their full size in a fall planting, but they're tough enough to kind of handle those frosts. I think it's usually about 70 to 90 days to harvest, but you can harvest them young too and kind of small as well. And then one of my favorites is also radishes. That's what's in the picture there. Those are I think the French breakfast radish. I love them because they're tiny and they're so quick. So this is one, that I don't think I could uplift enough. I think it's a great option for those of you who are just starting your fall planting or just, getting introduced to fall planting. These French breakfast radishes are a great option because they're tiny, they're quick. I think when we direct seeded these, it was usually about 30 days to get to that harvestable point. So it's satisfying, you feel like you're doing a great job. And they're also so cute. So these root crops are a great option to direct seed outdoors. And if it's your first time experimenting with a fall garden. These ones they were also, we planted these in a raised bed. You can do either option. Honestly, these would even be fine in a container because they're so small. So there's a lot of options as far as where you're going to grow these as well. Next slide. So other options for direct seeding outdoors. I mentioned these when I was talking about starting indoors as well. Things like lettuce and spinach and arugula. Again, sometimes starting that spinach indoors is you kind of have a leg up because you can control the conditions a bit more, and the seeds kind of like those cooler temps to germinate. But yeah, there's lettuce, spinach, arugula, also great options if you're growing in a container. And yeah, some of my favorites. I think there's different varieties of spinach out there as well. So some that might be a little more tolerant of the heat. And that could be really helpful if you are going to direct seed spinach outdoors, is trying to get your hands on maybe one of those varieties that's going to be a little bit more heat tolerant if you're going to be starting it outdoors at the end of summer direct seeding. That could be helpful. Again, I recommend looking at seed catalogs to try and find those varieties. That's a great option to, you can get lost in all the varieties that are out there, to be honest, but it's fun, and, keeping your mind on the prize that you're looking for one of those more heat tolerant varieties that you're going to direct seed outdoors. Next slide. So some herb options to direct seed outdoors. This includes things like cilantro, dills, and scallions. For scallions, they might not get to full size by the end or by the time of your first frost. But you can have baby scallions, which, are just as good, and they're cuter, and, still are going to have that awesome scallion flavor. Also cilantro and dill. These are great, again, because we're focusing on herbs just for that foliage. So, you're not trying to get a fruit out of them. You just want to get them to the point where you can harvest some of those leaves. So these are also good options, I think, if you are an experienced fall planter, or if not, these herbs will be good options for you. And again, containers, raised beds, in the ground, all great options. Next slide. So transplanting outdoors, a little bit of info. I know I've been, mentioning that word, the transplant, and I often get questions about when is it okay to put these seedlings outdoors. And so usually what I say is you want to check the plant stage. So, you want to make sure those seedlings are fully rooted. So when you tug up on the stem, you don't immediately pull it out because it just has one root. You want those roots to be well formed. You want to pull up and have it kind of grab some of the soil with it, fully rooted. You also want those transplants and those seedlings to have their true leaves. So that means when a seed germinates, it'll produce first these two leaves that are called the cotyledons. Those are the seed leaves. So that's too early to put them outdoors when they just have those seed leaves. What you're going to want to wait for is when they start to produce what we call the true leaves. So after they produce those two leaves, they're going to produce another set of leaves, the true leaves, and that will be another indicator that it is okay to kind of put them outdoors. And one thing I'll mention too is we often recommend hardening your transplants off. What that means is usually, if you have a tray of these seedlings, these transplants, they're fully rooted, they have those true leaves, it's almost time to get them outdoors, just kind of putting them outside for, 1 hour at a time, maybe about 10 days before you plant. So on day 1, putting them out for an hour, bringing them back inside. Day 2, putting them out for 2 hours, bringing them back inside. Day 3, 3 hours outdoors, back inside in that tray. And that's kind of going to help them just ease into the conditions of being outdoors, because we're starting these indoors where things are a little more controlled and very different than outdoors. So this hardening off can really help just ease those transplants into, what life outdoors is going to be like. And it kind of just gets them ready to handle the environment that they're going to be in. You also want to think about, your site or your container selection. So thinking about what plants you're going to plant, how many you should put in. You don't want to crowd them too. I mentioned spacing earlier. You want to make sure there's going to be enough space between them for that air movement to help prevent disease. And just, taking stock of what your site or your containers are going to be like. Another important piece before you transplant too is removing the weeds as best you can. I know this is the part that maybe frustrates a lot of us, is weeding, but it's really important because it helps give those transplants kind of a leg up where they don't have to compete with really tall weeds around them. They have space to develop, to grow, to get established. So, being mindful of removing any of those kind of tap-rooted weeds, so things like thistle is one that I battle with often, which is, totally a bear to remove because first off, it's really prickly, but just being mindful of digging up those tap roots, removing those weeds before they flower or they go to seed, because when they go to seed, that's how they are going to reproduce and come back. So trying to catch them before they even get to that stage can really help with management. And another option is if you're really on top of it, removing them at what we call the thread stage. That's like when they're really easy to pull because they're just tiny little seedlings that have just come up. That's my favorite time to weed because I just take a hoe and it's really easy to just scrape them out of the ground. So that's one that you'd have to be mindful of for timing, but just in general, making sure or doing your best to kind of remove weeds from that space so your transplants aren't going to have to compete with them too much can really help get those plants established in the fall garden. Next slide. And spacing. Yep, I've mentioned this so much because it's really important. I've heard the quote, begin with the end in mind. So space out your plants thinking about how big they're going to be at maturity. And you can find that information online. You can find it on the seed packet. If you're planting from seed, you can ask people at the garden center if you're buying your transplants there. But just being aware of what that mature plant size is going to be, again, to make sure you're not crowding your plants and you have proper airflow to help prevent diseases. And, it's also a great way to help, prevent pests, diseases, and things like that. Next slide. So when you're actually getting those transplants out into the garden, these are just some general recommendations, questions I get, about compost. Some people will top dress. So just putting down like an inch of compost. That's what we mean when we say kind of top dress with compost, just putting down kind of a thin layer, 1 inch layer of compost before you plant. As far as fertilizing goes, I always recommend fertilizing based on a soil test. So using that information, that's going to tell you, the current fertility of your soil, and then give you recommendations based on what your soil structure is like, the current fertility. So it's kind of catered to your site immediately. So you're not putting down too much or too little at the site, because too much, can cause pollution, it's runoff, it's, not good. So just being mindful of fertilizing just based on your soil test. Another great thing is to mulch. I love mulch. It's, totally your friend in the garden. It really helps prevent weeds. It kind of just puts down, essentially, it's kind of just like a barrier that you put down on the ground. So mulching to prevent weeds can be really helpful. People will use, wood mulch. People will use straw. There's a lot of options out there for the different types of mulches. Next slide. And then, so when you're also, you have your transplants out in the garden, making sure you are watering them properly. So as soon as you plant them, make sure you give them a good water, because that'll help them get established. You just don't want to put them out and then forget about them. They're trying really hard to, kind of get those roots in the ground to establish themselves, and making sure you water them in can be really helpful. And then just being mindful of watering. So you can use like a touch test, when the soil feels dry, it's probably a good time to water. Try not to overwater. And then some other basics that I like to recommend are watering in the morning or, early afternoon, just so the foliage in the plant will have time to dry off. This can really help with preventing disease, because a lot of those fungal diseases that we might see, kind of like that moist, humid conditions, that can come from that water sitting on the plant foliage. And then I'll also try to avoid watering the foliage just in general. So watering at the base of the plant can also be really helpful if you're trying to prevent disease and things like that. And especially if you are growing things like broccoli and cauliflower, not getting water on that flower head, so the piece you're going to eat, trying not to get any water on that flower head because that can lead to rot and things like that. And then your hard work, will have rotted away. So making sure you are watering those plants at the base can be really helpful to kind of prevent any of that disappointment, I would say. So next slide. And then earlier I mentioned, when to plant will depend on your first frost, but also maybe some tools that you have. So these are season extension tools. So things like row cover and hoops. You can see them in the picture there. This is when I used these hoops, which are kind of just like this metal rod, bended into a hoop. And then row cover, which is kind of just like a fabric covering. And usually you can buy them online. Seed companies will also sometimes sell row cover. You might be able to find it at like a feed and seed store, maybe even some of the big box stores will have these season extension tools. So this row cover, again, is kind of like this piece of fabric that you'll put over your plants, and it can be really helpful to kind of maintain heat in that structure. So it kind of gives you this extension, right? Because it's trapping this heat even as things are getting cooler, which can kind of help you, extend your crops a little bit longer. It's also a great option if you're trying to keep pests out. So things like insects, it's again, sort of just like this barrier over the plant that is going to keep those pests out. Next slide. So pest management. I mentioned a few things earlier. So making sure you're watering properly, watering at the base of the plants. You can choose resistant varieties. So if you know that you have struggled with a specific pathogen in your garden in the past, maybe looking into resistant varieties for that pathogen, you can find that information. I think there's the Cornell Vegetable MD site that has information about these varieties, as well as those seed catalogs. And then as far as pest management too, understanding your site, making sure you're spacing well, cleanliness can be really important. So if, making sure you're clearing out any leaves that have dropped, any foliage that have dropped, any fruit, maybe from your warm season crops, you're planting into the same site that those were in, try and clean it out. Again, just to remove any of that debris. That can really help prevent disease and help prevent those pests from kind of hanging around because they have those food source. Also, rotating your crops. This is, essentially what you want to think is if you had something like beans in a space one year, you'll want to plant something unrelated to that the next year. So say you had beans, you might want to plant like kale in that space next time. And that can help just kind of prevent any of those pests that are pretty host specific from hanging around in that area too much. And then also scouting. This is one that I love to encourage because really it's just kind of getting out into the garden, looking at your plants, flipping over the leaves, looking for insects, and trying to understand, what you might be dealing with in your garden. And the pest on the slide right now is one of the cabbage loopers. These are, the small green caterpillars that we get on a lot of those, like things like broccoli, kale, cabbage, things like that. We also might see, flea beetles, might see aphids, and also vertebrae pests. I know Karen mentioned that she battles deer, and vertebrae pests can be really challenging. I think the main way to try and keep them out is using barriers. So using that row cover, fences. I know it's a huge investment, but keeping those fences up. If you're trying to keep groundhogs out, using like chicken wire fence and burying it in the ground. There's a lot of options. I would recommend if you're battling those vertebrae pests, you can call the Lawn and Garden hotline, and we can kind of brainstorm together. They can be challenging for sure. Next slide. So I'm going to briefly just get into another option. So we got into, fall vegetables that we can plant. But if you are just totally exhausted from your summer garden and you just want a break, one option is to plant a cover crop. So, again, if you are exhausted and you just want to throw some seed down, a cover crop is a great option. The benefits, cover crops can help reduce soil erosion, so you don't just have like this fallow space. And even things like raised beds, you don't leave that fallow space where that soil is going to erode off with wind and things like that. They can help build the soil. They can compete with weeds in that area. And there are a bunch of types out there. I'm going to start with the types that can be winter killed. So this means, you'll plant them in fall, and they'll be killed over winter because they can't withstand, those freezing temperatures. There's a few options out there for these winter killed types. So oats, peas, buckwheat, daikon radish, mustard, and crimson clover. I used oats and peas last year in the space where I was growing. You can see in that picture here, we seeded it, I believe, in September. This is what it looked like in October. I was really heavy-handed with the seed. I'm not sure if you can tell, but it was really dense. I was so excited. But there's usually information about seeding density online and on the packages and things like that. And one thing I'll say too is you can see daikon radish on the slide there. Daikon radish can be a really good option if you have very compacted soil, because they will form, that thick radish root that can really help kind of break up the soil. So if compacted soil is something that you are dealing with, daikon radish might be a great cover crop option that will be winter killed. So next slide. So this is what that oat and pea planting looked like in March of 2020. So after we planted, I think that should be March of 2021. Sorry. But we planted last fall. This is what it looked like this spring. And I was very pleased. It was kind of just a dense mat of these winter killed oats and peas. Thanks. Yeah, next slide. And then, so spring termination crops include things like winter rye, red clover, hairy vetch, and then crimson clover. The one in that picture there is crimson clover. So these are options that will be able to kind of overwinter. If you plant them in fall, they will survive the winter and then come back in spring. So usually what you'll have to do is something called the spring termination, so you can start planting your garden in spring. So you can do things like covering it with plastic, or covering these plants with plastic to kind of solarize them. So it just gets really hot under that plastic and they die. You can mow them, you can till them in. There's a few different options for those spring terminating crops. Sorry. And with MSU Extension, we also have some really helpful urban cover crop information as well, that just will walk you through a bit more about these types of cover crops, what they're good for, and then also how to terminate them. Next slide. And again, cover crops are great options if you are just over the garden and you want to break, but you want to put something there that is going to help the soil, help the garden. And in this photo here, this is, an option for spring termination. This is really just covering the cover crop with plastic. Like I said, solarizing, so the plant underneath will die. It's going to get so hot that it dies. Other options are mowing, tilling, and things like that. And I will say this ended up being a great option. So we did the oats and the peas and then covered it with this plastic, actually after they had died, because those are winter killed types. But this soil was excellent to plant into. I was very pleased with how that worked out. Next slide. So these are some resources from MSU. So we, of course, have our Gardening in Michigan website. We have the Lawn and Garden Hotline. That's operating every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 9 a.m. to noon. If you want to just talk through some of these fall crop options and just have more questions, please call the hotline. We're happy to answer. We're happy to help and sort of brainstorm and walk through things. if you need help planning and deciding, we're here to help. There's also our Ask an Expert tool. Now it's called Ask Extension, but this is kind of like the online version of the hotline where you can ask questions and we're here to answer. There's the Cornell Vegetable MD online site. That is where I mentioned that you can find some of those resistant vegetable varieties. Again, you can refer to seed companies and their catalogs, looking at your seed packets and trying to, do that research to choose varieties that are going to work in your space. And next slide. And I think that is it for me. We, I believe, are ready to move on to questions, and I'm sure there are a lot.
Hi, Isabel. That was great. That was great. Yeah, it kind of got me interested. I might want to try some of these things.
Oh, yeah? Yeah.
So we've got some good questions.
Okay.
There's one from Pamela. She's wondering how should oregano and basil be grown from seed? I don't know if she's meaning like indoors or.
Oh, like direct seeding versus indoors.
Yeah.
Those are ones that I would maybe start indoors.
Okay.
I think just because I've been successful starting them indoors, I don't think I've ever tried to direct seed either one of those. Again, just starting indoors, you have a little more control.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what I've been successful with. So I would say, that's what I would recommend.
Okay. And then here's a question from David. He says, my tomatoes are not turning red. And then he put in quotes, Grosse Pointe rains.
Okay. Yeah. So tomatoes are one of those warm season crops. So, what I can think is that they might just need more time. They might need more exposure, to sun. I'm not sure if they are being grown in the shade, but those are one of those warm season crops that likes a lot of sun, a lot of heat, and, mindful watering as well. But they might just need more time. Also, I've been asked this before too, and it ended up being just a green variety. So there's a lot of variables out there. What I would say now, with where we are in the season, maybe just give them a little more time and hopefully they turn red. If not, maybe they needed more sun and something like that.
Okay. So I know we had so much rain in so many areas. I think a lot of people are wondering what's going on. And
oh yeah, it's been weird, right? Because it was really hot and really dry, and then it got kind of cool and really wet. So plants are super responsive to those peculiar things in the environment. Right. And yeah, for sure, they could just be trying to figure themselves out.
Right.
And needing more time, right? Right. They need the an evening out of our environment, the climate, and things like that.
Here's another question from Pamela. And I know you talked about this a little bit, but what would you suggest to deter animals like squirrels? She said she's tried hanging Irish Spring soap near the plants. Any other ideas?
Squirrels are the worst. I'm so sorry. I struggle with squirrels too. They just seem malicious. Yeah. Like just digging my seedlings out of the containers and leaving them. So, all I can really suggest for things like that is, there are repellents out there. Those are ones that you're going to have to consistently use because, they break down, they wash away very quickly. But what really works are those physical barriers. So, if you can put up mesh wire around your containers as sort of this barrier, that could be an option. Even like that plastic mesh, just to keep, I know it also is upsetting because doesn't look good, but if you're trying to get a harvest out of the plant, sometimes it's just what you have to do is put this plastic up or this mesh up to keep those squirrels off of it.
Yeah. Okay. And then here's another question from Pamela. She's doing a balcony garden again this year. Do you have any suggestions for vegetables and herbs that, for a balcony?
Yeah, so I mentioned those breakfast radishes. I think those would be a great one, again, because they're tiny. Radishes are also, I'm not sure how much, sun exposure the balcony gets, but they're usually pretty easy to grow and sort of, we've grown them under row cover and they're happy. So in that sort of kind of shady environment, they were pretty easy to work with. So those smaller radishes, I would definitely recommend. Some herbs, you could do maybe like fennel or cilantro. I'll say too that there are a lot of kind of balcony varieties out there. So like the smaller varieties. Again, something you might have to do a little bit of research to find those varieties, to find the smaller ones that aren't going to get huge. I know because dill gets massive, right? So there might be types out there that'll be much better for growing in a small space. But I just can't talk enough about those small radishes. They're just fast and you feel good about it, and you can get
I want to try those.
Yeah, we had we had a few harvests in the spring, when things were kind of cooler, and then again in the fall, because they're 30 days to harvest, and you just direct seed them. And
I assume they're very mild flavor and
because they're kind of those baby types.
Cool.
And you can use you can grow. There's also carrot varieties out there that are going to be those smaller varieties as well, and I think those would also do well in containers. As long as you like baby vegetables.
Well, good. Here's another question from Karen, actually. How do you successfully move herbs inside when the weather gets bad?
Yeah, so I would say the first thing is to have them in a container. And how do you successfully move them inside? I think that's a challenging question. I'm not sure if this person wants to know tools to make it easier, but I would move them inside when the weather is bad and then move them back outside when it gets better. That might be a simple answer, but
okay.
And I guess I would say that you wouldn't want to keep them indoors for too long, which is maybe what this person is getting at. If we have, I don't know, I'm trying to think of an example of it's really cold, moving them indoors for a few days and then moving them back outdoors, would be fine. And if you're growing them indoors, give them as much light as possible.
Okay. Would a grow light help?
Yeah, it would.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Here's a question from Dawn. She asks if you could explain soil test. She said, who can do it other than MSU Extension people? Could Horrocks or Lansing Gardens or others? And what should she provide? A cup of the soil, several containers, dry or moist? How long for a result? I think she just wants more info on it.
Yeah. So, I will say I am most familiar with the MSU soil test, mostly because, it's mostly catered to home gardeners and you're given the specific information. But I know there are other companies out there. I'm not sure if any of those local, plant producers will do it. I think it's probably worth asking them if they do. And usually as far as the amount goes, maybe a small, Ziploc bag full will be enough. And then whatever site you are getting tested, try to collect maybe 10 random samples from around that spot and then mix them together and then use part of that as your sample, if that makes sense, because you want to get sort of a representative sample of the space that you're going to be planting. And as far as timing goes, I know for the MSU soil test, it's usually about 2 weeks once they get your sample in the lab. For other places that will do soil testing, I'm not sure. I would imagine it's probably similar, but I imagine it also depends on the time, in the season and how many people are also getting their soil tested.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And here's another question about cover crops. How late do you plant a cover crop? And do they need 30 days or 60 days, etc., to, germinate?
Yeah, so let me think. In my experience, we did the oats and the peas. We planted them in September, and that was more than enough time for them to kind of grow up and get to full size.
Okay.
So I would imagine it's similar. You want to give them enough days to mature. I can't off the top of my head remember what those days are for all the different types, but I would try and get them in the ground so they could get to that, mature size,
Yeah. Right.
which would probably range to about a month to maybe like 3 months. So I would try and find that, date to maturity or days to maturity, and then backtrack from there to decide when you want to get them in the ground.
Okay. Okay. And then, what do you? Here's another question from Jamie about our critters.
Oh gosh, yeah.
What do you suggest for vole control?
Oh, yeah, voles. Yeah, they can be challenging too. I am not, and Teresa, if you have better ideas too, I'm not aware of any sort of, specific repellents that might work for them. I think I'm mostly familiar with traps. And as far as trying to manage, working with voles, I know people who will like plant things in containers in the ground. I think this is more so with like bulbs and things like that, where they're going to try and dig them and eat them. But voles can certainly be a challenge. And I think I'm mostly familiar with really just trapping them, unfortunately.
Yeah.
They're tricky.
I know. We've tried just chicken wire and putting it, digging it way down.
Yeah.
And that seems to help until they get smart and
Right.
somewhere else that you don't have it. But
Yeah, it's kind of something similar for like groundhogs. I think it's just getting it deep enough to the point where they don't want to dig anymore. For
Right.
groundhogs, if you like put that chicken, I don't know if you can tell, that chicken wire in the ground, so it's like goes like
right.
this, so
Yeah.
that they can't dig under it.
Yeah.
I would imagine something like that would work similarly for voles.
Yeah. Yeah. So people, if you have other questions, go ahead and enter them now. One thing too I wanted to ask you was, for the row covers, sun still gets through those row covers?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
I think there's different like weights that you can buy. So you can buy like a thinner weight and a thicker weight. And one will allow more sun than the other. In my experience,
if it's a sunny day, do you roll the cover off?
Yeah. So if it's sunny and really warm, I would maybe roll it up like on the sides and take it off, just because, if we're thinking about fall crops that kind of like get a little bit cooler, you don't want it to get to like up to 90 under that row cover.
Right.
So that's when kind of like taking it off and letting them breathe for a minute.
Then put it back.
Yeah, and then putting it back on. Just thinking about how that heat's going to build up underneath it and inside of it.
Okay. And, well, unless someone sends in another question, we don't have any other questions right now.
Okay. Yeah, and I know it's a lot of information, but I guess what I would say is maybe if this is like your first time doing a fall garden, try and choose maybe some of what I, deemed those easier crops, so like the lettuces, those smaller root veggies that you can direct seed.
Right.
Always a good place to start, and then figure out how much more time and energy you want to invest. Is a good place to start.
Okay. Well, I think this was wonderful, and maybe now we get Karen back and.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you so much for great information. Really great information. I was the question about herbs, and every fall I try bringing my herbs that I've planted in containers on my deck inside, and they all die on me within about a month.
Oh, okay. So you are like bringing them inside to overwinter them.
Yes.
Right.
And so is there a way to successfully do that? Because they always die on me.
Yeah. I have a friend who has overwintered rosemary just fine. I think, like Teresa said, having a grow light could be really helpful. And maybe like, you know, kind of like I mentioned with those transplants, we call it hardening off, but it's really just like easing them into a new environment.
Okay.
So if you're trying to like bring them inside, maybe like do it a little bit at a time, you know, inside and then put them outside and then inside. But I think really that grow light is probably the key ingredient that would be helpful.
Okay. Well, great.
And one thing I'll say too, which is challenging with growing things indoors is, especially in Michigan, by the time we're moving things indoors, our heat is coming on. So it can be really dry and again, really different than what it's like outside. So just, you know, being mindful of those different conditions and trying to keep things watered and just being mindful that it's really dry inside when we turn on our heat.
Yeah. Well, I know that my herbs don't like it and they die on me every year. So.
Yeah. Again, it's kind of like a stark transition for them, right? They've been like happy outside and then they're like, excuse me?
Right.
Where am I?
Well, thank you so much, Isabel, and thank you, Teresa. Great information. So in case the audience wants to sort of watch this again, maybe they missed part of it or something, they can watch it again on our virtual events page on demand, or back on our Facebook page right after we're done here today. And don't forget, for those who are watching, that you can check out our other upcoming virtual events on the AARP Michigan virtual events page. So thank you again. Thank you to our audience for joining us. And we hope to have you back in the spring, Isabel, for some more spring planting expert advice.
Yeah, definitely.
So thank you, and thank you to our audience. Have a great day.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
Thanks.